It's dark. It's late. It's Alex. And I want to talk about a scary subject. So I'm doing it at night, under the cover of darkness. I want to talk about political spectrum in America, a little bit of a historical analysis to breathe life into right now. It's terrifying. So I brought some Kit Kats. I'm just kidding. We're not going to talk about this in the dark. You guys don't mind if I eat, right? Brought some water too. Alright, now that I've had a snack, let's get down to business. I want to cover a little bit of like the history of the Republicans and the Democrats, and what that means in terms of political spectrum in America. I think there's been a lot of confusion, and one of the things that I think Republicans in particular today have had a lot of trouble wrapping their head around is that there was an era in our history, like 1900 to 1920 or so. It was definitely, into the 1930s and beyond, but called the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era is when all sorts of great things happened. There was a lot of protections that Roosevelt put into the New Deal. Women's suffrage happened around then. And those things truly set us up for certain success today, just as any progressive movement in history has done. You look at the workers' rights movement, early 1900s, that did move into the 1940s with Truman's Labor Standards Amendment Act that actually put into place a lot of the Amendment Acts previously with labor standards that hadn't actually really helped all of the workers in the country and established like more of a complete set of rules, regulations around like minimum wage and how many hours you can work and things like that. So I want to cover a little bit of this history and help us understand underlying party, right? Because party isn't always going to help us. What does it mean to be progressive, right? What side of the political spectrum have bad things been on, and what side of the spectrum have good things been on? And I know this is going to be really uncomfortable, and so I still have more Kit Kats. So in 1913, the Department of Labor is established, and this begins sort of an interesting trajectory towards all the way to the 1940s, 1949 or something, where actual labor laws and all those things were actually gone. They went into effect for everybody across the board. And critically, 1900 to 1920 was the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era we're going to get back to because this is super important in terms of understanding politics in America and understanding the political spectrum in America. So let's look at what we have today. Today we have the Democratic Party, which looks like the left side sometimes. Some of us see it as like a very centrist party a lot of the time because it's very establishment and protecting the status quo. But for all intents and purposes, we'll consider it the left party because we have a two-party system. So we have the left party of the Democrats, we have the right party of the Republicans. And nobody on the Republican side is denying that they're on the right side of the spectrum, right? They're right politics. So we've got our progressives over here on the left, and we've got our conservatives over here on the right. Nobody disagrees on that separation. In fact, today we're more than ever divided along that line. What does that mean historically? Like, how do we end up here? And I think what I found interesting recently is like seeing a lot of Republicans saying things like, oh, look, the KKK was a Democratic Party creation, right? It came out of the Democratic Party. And this is where we get into some trouble, because we start looking at party instead of political spectrum. We're looking at some sort of brand, instead of ideology. And what I really want to accomplish is I want to show that in every instance in American history, it hasn't been about Democrats versus Republicans. In fact, for a lot of our history, those weren't even the full names or the delineation of politics. You look at Roosevelt, who split the Republican vote and during the Progressive era, and we almost ended up with this like middle party. They were called the Bull Moose Party, and they were no longer Republicans. We saw this trend where the progressives during the Progressive era broke apart from party lines, and we ended up with these Federalists and these other parties like breaking into something new. And you look all throughout history, we had actually for a lot of it, we had more than two parties. There was like, just like today, there was like single issue parties like the Prohibition Party. So we look at party too much today as something that matters historically a little bit too much, because it unfortunately matters so much today. And that, like I said, gets us into trouble, because what it means is that Republicans today are able to absorb and represent extremely problematic ideology because of certain comforts that they hold that helps them ignore the historical significance of right-wing politics and conservatism, and ignore the fact that every other positive thing that we have today was the result of progressive ideology fighting for it against conservative opposition. The conservatives fighting to conserve what they have, fighting to conserve their way of life and stop those immigrants or stop those other people from threatening. And ultimately, things like women's suffrage and civil rights and even slavery, going back to slavery, looking at child labor laws and labor laws in general and unions, there's a lot that has protected people now that were critically progressive movements. And the opposition, at the end of the day, were right-wing conservatives, just like today, fighting against the things that they felt would destroy their country and take their way of life from them and take their freedoms from them. And that's a very interesting phenomenon to understand historically, because it is happening today in a lot of the same ways. And people will deny that, right? If you actually bring up political spectrum, I had it the other day, trying to explain that you can't look at the Democratic Party back when the KKK was formed. You can't think of today's Democratic Party in that way, because the Progressive era completely changed, the sides that our parties today represented on the political spectrum, tangibly. And so one of the things that I really want to bring up is that the KKK very openly, like, this is not like a secret. You can look it up. I'll show it. The KKK is a far right organization. They always have been. They even say they're conservatives. Every white supremacy group today, and I think in terms of history, have always been right-wing groups. They're on the right. They're conservatives, because what they're trying to do inherently is conserve their white supremacy, to conserve their white power, to conserve separation of race, um, so that they feel empowered in being white, and the disparities between race being in their favor. That's a problem. We can't deny that all of our progressive movements, um, that we accept, every single other one that everybody on the right today accepts. Obviously, they accept that women should be allowed to vote, and own property, and things like that. Obviously, they accept that Black people are people. Well, um, most Trump Republicans, I think, would admit that, like, they would at least say that Black people should be allowed to own things. They should be allowed to vote. That they're people. That, none of them, most of them, don't want to openly admit that they're racist. But here's kind of the catch, right? Is that all of today's white supremacy groups that do fall on the right, that are energized and excited about Trump's presidency, they don't think that. and if they do, some of the alt-right movement stuff, openly says that they want Black people to be free, that they want them to be able to have their own stuff, whatever. They just think that they should be separated, that that America is a white Eurocentric country at heart, that it's ours as white people, and that other people should go wherever they came from. So they believe strongly in the separation of race, which is obviously a very inherently racist idea. It's very conservative. It's very right-wing. The Nazi Germany was a far-right rise to fascism. I don't know, like, nobody should disagree with that. I think what's interesting with Nazi Germany is that people look at just the party again. What's happening here? They look at the party name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and they see the word socialist, and it's very upsetting, right? And you think of Nazi Germany as a socialist thing. No credible historian, no credible, political theorist looks at Nazi Germany as a socialist movement. They look at it as a very right-wing rise to fascism. And what I think was interesting about the Socialist German Workers' Party is that it did so. It was successful because it convinced the German workers that they had all these external forces that they had to worry about, that were threatening their way of life, and they had to conserve it. And in order to conserve it, they were given this, white supremacist ideology that dictated, obviously, a lot of behavior after that we look back on very negatively now. The parallels are very unfortunate, right? Because you have two leaders who take advantage of hardworking people in their country. They tell them that they're going to protect them from these external forces that are coming to threaten them and take their way of life and take their jobs and whatever. That we have to keep those people out. And we see an energization of white supremacy groups, things like that. It's a lot of the same. There's a lot of parallel there of how that rise to fascism happens. It's not like an overnight process. It's a very slow process. We had a Nazi rally in New York. It sold out Madison Square Garden in 1913. A lot of people, I don't think we learn about this in history class in school. They sold out Madison Square Garden. And there's thousands and thousands of people there who were scared. They're terrified of people coming in from somewhere else and taking their white American way of life, threatening their constitutional rights as Americans to not feel threatened or diversified in any way. And unfortunately, that's the narrative that we see now, right? So I think what I really want to express here, that I want to be clear on, is that all of the bad things in history have come out of conservatives on the right side fighting to maintain their way of life or their quality of life, or protect themselves from some other person's way of life or quality of life that they want to impose on them. And so that's everything from women's rights and gay rights and things like that. Those are, every single one of them was a fight. Again, I'll repeat this, it's going to sound repetitive, but it was a progressive fight on behalf of a minority or some oppressed group, and it was a rights opposition to it that was fighting to conserve their way of life without it. We're in a situation today where we see that trickle-down economics has failed us. So we see a lot more of the same problems that we dealt with in the progressive era in terms of like workers' rights and being able to earn a living wage, which is what the minimum wage was established for. And there isn't a single place in this country where you can live and own a house and have your provide for your family on minimum wage. It's not possible. So I've talked a lot about sides of the political spectrum. Talked a lot about really the fact that every progressive movement, all of the progress that we accept today in terms of women's rights and civil rights and things like that, workers' rights, those were all progressive movements with right-wing conservative opposition. We understand that all of the white supremacy groups like the KKK and even like alt-right groups that seem a little bit more mild but are still extremely problematic in terms of racism and nationalism. Those are all right-wing groups. They're proudly right-wing, they're proudly conservative, and they're proud Trump supporters. Look at any of their Facebook pages or websites, and Trump is their hero. They feel more energized by Trump's presidency than they have in a very, very long time in this country. So we see all this turmoil over civil rights. Today still, we see it over economic issues and disparities and lack of access. We've been seeing that for quite a while. We had Occupy Wall Street, and then beyond that, we ended up having a lot of civil rights activism happening, and people just saying like, hey, it's been a long time and we still have major racial disparities in this country, and they're the direct result of systematic racism. And today's rights, the conservatives that have historically always tried to preserve their way of life, to conserve what they're comfortable with over any sort of change in very problematic ways, almost all the time. They would much rather deny that it doesn't exist, which I guess is somewhat of an improvement of previous eras where they're like, yeah, it exists, but it's not a problem, or yeah, it exists because I want it to exist. And they're that way about other things, right? But I think what I'm confused on is the attachment to party, when historically speaking, parties have changed significantly over time. The progressive era had a huge effect on that. It's impossible to talk about politics from a historical standpoint and in terms of social issues over time. In terms of progress over time, it's impossible to talk about those things if we're talking about party. It's just not possible. Today's Democratic Party is very centrist, very status quo. They're not really pushing a lot of truly progressive things. And there's a lot of data actually even using there's something called DW Nominate. There's different ways of sort of polling in a very unbiased manner, a very quantitative manner of like like how biased Congress people are. So what I'm getting to is that our country, the left movement right now, a lot of the real progress is not coming from politics to begin with. It's coming from people demanding it. And hopefully what we see as a result of that, rather than the rise of fascism being too late where they just squash it and we end up in a fascist regime before we could change it, ultimately what we need is some sort of leadership that truly represents us. And I think most real progressives in this country today would admit that the Democratic Party is not that party, that they don't really do a great job of representing our ideals, that they're the best option we have right now. But my hope is that as time progresses, as the urgency for change reaches more boiling points, unfortunately, and reaches those uncomfortable levels, that we will see better representation in terms of people running for office and people getting into office and people being able to make tangible change higher up, while those of us on the ground change the systems around us and advocate for change. You got two sides of the spectrum, right and left, and you've got these gradients in between. And our Democratic Party is nowhere near. It's way closer to the center than it is the end of the left side. And the right side, unfortunately, is much more closer on the right side of the spectrum, further out than it is the center of the full spectrum. It's just, we're in a very interesting time in history. It's an interesting situation to be in where people are straight up denying that pretty much everything we would all call evil in modern society has been, that is political, has been right-wing politics. It's been conservatism. It's been, an opposition to progress. And that's the situation we're in today. So I hope you have a Kit Kat to follow along with me. I hope it wasn't too scary to talk about. But I'm turning this light off because it's really bright in my face because it's night. You know how it is. Bye.